So on behalf of the Harry Bridges Center for Labor Studies and the Labor Solidarity Project at UWT, I'd like to welcome everybody to the final installment of our spring seminar series. And this marks the conclusion of our first full year of programming, which is, it's kind of wild to arrive at this moment. It's been an unprecedented year on so many levels, as I'm sure everyone can agree. But I will say, amidst all the chaos, these seminars have been, at least personally, I think a real source of comfort and inspiration. And so with today's presentation, we're now officially 20 performances deep. So I just wanted to take a second and thank those of you who've been zooming in over the last year and sharing this space. I regularly see when I look at the chat board, a lot of familiar names in that list, and I'm really just kind of honored to provide this platform and again to share this important work. And I think looking back on the last year, I think it's appropriate and kind of ironic that we're commemorating a year of programming with tonight's guest, Dr. Keri Leigh Merritt, because a little over a year ago, I first reached out to Keri Leigh about joining us in person for an event back when we did in-person events. I had just personally read her book, Masterless Men, Poor Whites and Slavery in the Antebellum South. And I was thinking about working it into an American Studies course that I was developing. And I mentioned it to my colleague, Mike Honey, and he'd actually just read it too, and agreed that it was absolutely fantastic. So we're both very excited about this. And then fast forward a year, a global pandemic, an election cycle that I think we're sort of all still recovering from. And we finally kind of come full circle. So the first name on the back of the proverbial envelope in terms of folks that I wanted to bring in to this seminar series is here to share her work with us. And over that last year, I've come to learn that Dr. Merritt is more than just the author of one award-winning study on race in the Antebellum South. She's also the co-editor, along with Matthew Hild, of Reconsidering Southern Labor History, Race, Class, and Power. She regularly contributes to national publications, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN, among others. She's the host of her own YouTube channel, which I think is just delightfully titled Meritocracy, History to the People, which I would highly recommend everyone check out. I've really enjoyed it. And then finally, as if she wasn't busy enough, she's also working on a new Civil War documentary that knowing her and her work, I don't think will be pulling any punches. So despite all of this, Keri Leigh's found time to join us this evening, all the way from Atlanta, Georgia, to share her talk, which she's called The Aftermath of 2020 and the Possibilities for a New America. So I'd like to encourage everyone to join me in welcoming her. Thank you so much for coming in and sharing your time and expertise.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you all for joining. I wanted to just preface this by saying this is kind of all new work, obviously, since it's on 2020. This is very new material. You guys are the first ones to hear it. And before I really get into everything, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge what a extraordinary time we're living through right now. And it is absolutely a terrifying time and a time of great uncertainty and great anxiety, but it's also an exhilarating time. And I think that if we kind of switch the way we think of this, this is a time of deep contemplation, of historical reckoning and psychological healing. And so it's a time to turn our outrage and anger and deep disheartening sadness over the last year, and indeed the last 4 or 5 years, into action. And we've been on a defense, playing defense for so long, in resistance for years. And there are plenty of people resisting. We need to step back, I think, and turn that anger and frustration into power. And realize that outrage really can be a generative thing. So stop resisting and start creating. And this is my attempt to really start thinking of how the left can have some kind of coherent path forward, some plan of progress, because it seems like, especially after this presidential election, there's really not one anymore. So to begin, let's see. I wanted to start with talking about the fact that the US is the only developed nation in the world with such abysmal rates of poverty and inequality. And it's got no real safety net for citizens in need and no promise of a minimum standard of living. And so I think a third Reconstruction and reconceptualizing what a third Reconstruction looks like is probably our most promising hope. Some of you may be wondering what I mean by a third Reconstruction. So Reconstruction can be defined by several factors, but put very simply, Reconstruction happens when the federal government steps in and intervenes in the states, whether through constitutional amendments, bills, federal legislation, to expand civil rights for American citizens. And so the first Reconstruction, we all know, comes after the Civil War, and really is, for a few short years, is an absolutely promising, hopeful time. We passed the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments, expanding rights and privileges to Black Americans. But of course, this still fell far short of what we needed. And the second Reconstruction, some of you may know if you're in the activist community, but for those of you who are not in the activist community, this is the civil rights movement, essentially. This is 1950s and 60s. The activists at that time called it a second Reconstruction, push for a second Reconstruction. A lot of academics call it that as well. And so, of course, with the second Reconstruction, we get the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the 1965 Voting Rights Act. And of course, as we know now, we're still fighting the forces of even having those rights of that 65 Voting Rights Act in particular. So if you follow the current Poor People's Campaign, then you may have heard of this third Reconstruction, the idea of the third Reconstruction. And I'm really sure that I've witnessed the third Reconstruction, the beginnings of the third Reconstruction in the past few years, and certainly within this past summer and the Black Lives Movement, civil rights movement. I think it's all starting to come together. And so in addition to the vast racial wealth gap caused by white supremacy in this country and during the horrors of slavery, Jim Crow and beyond, we must keep in mind that the recession of 2007 and 8 hit Americans hard, and it hit the poorest Americans even harder. And so while white people have recovered about half the wealth that they lost in that recession, Black Americans have not. They have barely regained about half the wealth lost in that. And that, of course, was prior to what we went through in 2020 with COVID. Let me change the slide. And so what I want to talk about tonight is that we really need a new generation of charismatic leaders. We need to start thinking about, how to reach people via social media networks and non-television type commercials. We need to cater to people's short attention spans. And I think we've got to learn to work within this prism. And so I call this a 12-step program, essentially, my kind of vision for the future of a path forward for the left. And it's kind of funny, but it also makes a lot of sense that, yes, this is taken from an addiction program, because in many ways we are addicted to not changing things in this country, especially white Americans. So this 12-step program that I've outlined has 4 phases that we'll go through. And I'm just quickly going to go through some of them and concentrate most heavily on the question of labor, because that's obviously why I'm here tonight. And so I think one of our biggest things is that we've really got to start appealing to young people and the disaffected, people that don't usually vote, and get them to turn out, get them to understand the way that politics can change their economic situations and really, really relate the political to the economic. And so the first slide is, I kind of put these 4 sections into kind of what we look at as the year. So the first section is the season of fall, and that's a season of pruning and cutting and paring down. And so really getting at the very basics of what we need to do to change the system is, number one, before you do anything else, you've got to get money out of politics. This is where I think, people like Bernie Sanders had it absolutely correct. We've got to divorce money from politics, or we will never be able to change anything else on this list, or anything else, of substance to working class and poor people. Number 2, the Voting Rights Act, which obviously they're working on right now. We've got to pass this John Lewis Voting Rights Act, get hopefully through that as well. We can talk about issues like getting rid of the Electoral College, abolishing the Senate, hopefully, and replacing it with something more akin to a parliamentary system, making sure that one person has one vote. And even, I think, rethinking the way that our elections are structured and getting on some sort of national schedule where even local elections are tied to the same dates as national elections. So you don't have certain states where you have really, really low voter turnouts in local and state elections, and Republicans are able to suppress the vote and keep poor and working class people essentially powerless. Number 3 is to restructure our completely outdated political system. I think this includes things like popularly electing all judges, having them be accountable to the people. The separation of all courts in the judicial system from family, criminal, and civil courts, so that there are actually different judges that have expertise in these cases, and you're not having somebody who's trying a murder also dealing with issues of custody. And I think another really important point for this is to get rid of the jury system, right? The jury system is a complete fraud in our country. It always has been. It's a propagation for racial status quo, racist status quo. And I think we can look at countries like Australia and several other countries where they actually have popularly elected judges, a panel of 3 judges or something like that on each case to decide the merits of the case. And then again, those judges will be accountable to the people. So it's not this racist jury section, which I'm in the South, that has ruined many, many, many thousands, if not millions of lives. And I'm going to keep moving forward so we can get to the labor section. But so winter is a season of kind of hunkering down, hard work, holding steady. And so that's when you get into issues of tax, trade, and diplomacy, and really making major reforms to our tax system, making sure that all forms of income and wealth are taxed, including money made off of inheritance and capital gains and gifts. And the wealth tax, what we're talking about now, many progressives have been pushing for it. That absolutely has to happen. There's zero reason that anyone in our country should be a billionaire, and we have to actually start enforcing this. Number 5, which is 2 right here, is the police and prison abolition or reform. So the carceral state, really tackling the carceral state and total criminal justice overhaul, decarceration for all nonviolent offenders, drug offenders, and then basically to completely restructure and demilitarize the police, turn them into something more akin to community helpers, social workers, a team of social workers. This obviously would cause a large wave of unemployment in our system. And I will talk about in a minute how we can actually deal with, the system of actually abolishing the police and abolishing our jail and prison system. What are we going to do with all those people who actually work there? And then number 3 on this is repair the immigration system. Sorry, I've got a little typo. But repairing the immigration system is obviously tied in to police and prison abolition and reform, but it's also, absolutely integral to making sure that every person who lives in America, lives with basic humanity, basic decency, and human rights. And now we get into spring, and spring is where I'm going to spend the most time talking about, because this is when you've got everything pared down, you've got everything taken care of that you need to get out of the way, and now you can actually work on regenerating and regrowth and renewal and creating things essentially. And so first, if you ask me, is there one single thing that I could have in all of America, any kind of legislation, it would be single payer universal health care. We desperately need it. We are the only developed nation in the world to not have it. And the fact that we have gone through a just destructive, devastating pandemic where people are going bankrupt over their bills, people are going bankrupt trying to bury the dead. And literally nothing has been done about this, even under a Democratic president, shows us exactly how powerful this would be in revolutionizing America. I mean, the people that are pushing against this know how this would revolutionize everything from, the fact that people have to take jobs and work for horrible bosses at unlivable wages because healthcare is tied to jobs. The fact that that is the single number one reason why people go bankrupt in America. That is the number one reason, is that they have medical bills. So it's just completely unethical and completely unsustainable. We're going to have people being turned out of their homes in the millions if we don't actually do something to correct our healthcare system. Number two on here is the complete educational overhaul. We need a complete overhaul, and to basically start from scratch, especially with K through 12. We need to add things like universal preschool, centers for night childcare for people who labor at night. We need to make public college free for everyone, and have private colleges hopefully do something where there's some sort of a sliding scale for people who go there. We also need to work on really reinvigorating and kind of reinstating our system of vocational schools and vocational training. And I can't, just as anecdotally, I can't tell you how many times I've been in an Uber or something where it's someone who has had a 4-year college degree and they're out there being a teacher for many years, or doing another job like that, and they end up going into plumbing or into being an electrician or something like that, because they're going to make at least 50%, if not 100% more of what they make with a 4-year college degree. And I think that by fully funding these vocational schools and offering to people in that way, you also help to kind of demilitarize the US, because so many people who don't have a way to pay for college or pay for school or pay for training go into the military simply for that. So the third thing that I'm going to spend most of my time on is the labor issue, the question of labor. And so I primarily want to talk about UBI and FJG. And I actually believe that we should have both of these things. So the UBI is the Universal Basic Income, and the FJG is the Federal Jobs Guarantee. Now, involved in all of this is, of course, a Green New Deal, because that is absolutely essential to moving forward. And that would actually drive a lot of these new jobs under the Federal Jobs Guarantee. And so, we need teeth in all of the government protections that we have for workers. And this would be one of the only way that workers could be protected in private companies, as if they have this public option, right? And so in addition to creating this Green New Deal, and particularly here in the Sun Belt South, the South has done almost nothing to innovate with kind of, whether it's solar panels or whatever. We're literally in the Sun Belt South, and there are no solar panels anywhere. Instead, we're paying farmers not to grow, peanuts or cotton or whatever. And I want to just kind of think about that the main reason for poverty in America is not necessarily the lack of jobs, right? It's the lack of living wage and of a social safety net. And according to the Economic Policy Institute, a full quarter of full-time workers, and this was prior to COVID, a full quarter of full-time workers still earn poverty level wages. And so a living wage, the minimum pay needed for the basic standards of living in any kind of developed country, has obviously become a rallying cry for workers all over the country. We see this with Fight for 15, with the Poor People's Campaign. It's really gained steam, and I think hopefully in the next year or so, we will see some legislation. We'll see if the Democratic leadership actually grows a spine and deals with it. But full employment is really important. People need jobs that are year-round as opposed to seasonal work. They need jobs that pay a living wage and include benefits. If we don't have things like universal health care, but we still need things like disability insurance and retirement funds. So without these things, even people who work more than full time. And I know this obviously from being a graduate student, a poor graduate student. I was working, 2 other jobs in addition to my graduate stipend and still couldn't make ends meet. So they can expect to work, 70 hours a week and not be able to pay the most basic bills. And this is just completely ethically, morally unacceptable. And as technological innovation further leads to the loss of different sectors of American jobs and further threatens the plight of poor and working class people, then we really need to think about how to alleviate the hardship and suffering among the nation's most impoverished. And so in addition to these standard social safety nets, we do need both a UBI and an FJG. So the UBI would be for the people who really, really needed it, people who could not endure any type of traditional job, any full-time employment, whether that be because of age, illness, disability, caretaking, or even student status. And as baby boomers grow older and age and need care and healthcare, and as students struggle to earn an education without going deeply, deeply into debt, and parents yearn to stay home with their young infants and children, a UBI would completely revolutionize society as we know it. It would make us, from one of the least happy developed nations in the world to one of the happiest, I think, almost immediately. And proposals vary, but with costs depending on whether or not UBI would be paired with other social programs like universal health care, professors estimate that at about $6,000 per child and $12,000 per adult, the net cost of UBI would be about $539 billion per year. And that number sounds astronomical, I know, but when you put it into perspective, a UBI would cost less than 25% the cost of current US entitlement spending. So it actually ends up saving money, less than 15% of overall federal spending, and it's about 2.95% of our gross domestic product. So it's really actually not that much in terms of our overall budget. But the benefits to a UBI, it would immediately lift more than 43 million people out of poverty, including almost 15 million children. And of course, those rates are pre-COVID as well. So those numbers have just been skyrocketing and they are going to continue to skyrocket. And as basic income advocate Scott Santens points out, for the cost of UBI to truly be accurate, economists need to deduct all of the costs of the social safety net programs and tax credits that the UBI would replace. So actually it would be even less than that. And so depending on the other choices that we as a country would make, the other political choices, the total cost of the UBI could be somewhere in the hundreds of billions of dollars, but the cost of not eliminating poverty in this country is already over $3 trillion a year. So, I mean, if you really want to run the numbers, if you want to play the math game, if you want to do a net sum game, it makes sense to do this. Now, of course, I said the UBI needs to be paired with a FJG. The vast majority of Americans want to work. They derive a sense of pride and fulfillment and identity from their jobs. And an FJG would undoubtedly transform the United States. Taking the best aspects from the New Deal and learning lessons from that era about what not to do and how not to do things. FJG would have the power to completely rebuild our nation's infrastructure. It would modernize our country and it would make it accessible to most non-car owners. It would radicalize our choices in aging and end-of-life care as more Americans could stay at home with loved ones and have medical professionals and caretakers come into their homes. Additionally, I think we might finally have enough qualified professionals under an FJG to engage in mental health care, something this country needed horribly before 2020, but definitely needs it on a scale that no one still alive today can remember historically needing before. And this would obviously also help to really alleviate some of the nation's rampant drug and alcohol abuse and would definitely help temper those type of addictions. An FJG would also unquestionably help narrow the achievement gap in schools, as high quality universal childcare could be offered from infancy. As I pointed out, we desperately need those, early childhood, preschools and things open. And for many women with children, an FJG would allow them to continue their own careers without worrying about earning less than what their childcare costs. And quite honestly, people ask me all the time why I don't teach. Well, I was bound to Atlanta. There were not any tenure track jobs in a 2-hour radius when I graduated in 2014 at one of the lowest times in the market. And if I was to teach a class, it would cost, I would be earning less than what it cost for me to get childcare in Atlanta. I would be losing money by teaching. So just as with a UBI, costs associated with an FJG vary widely according to multiple factors. But according to the Center of American Progress, an FJG could create 4 million jobs at $15 an hour plus benefits. And that would be at a cost of something like $158 billion a year. And that's a figure equaling only a quarter of the currently proposed tax cuts for the rich. And this was 2 years ago. So, it's really nothing. Even on the higher end, and these are according to Duke University economist William Sandy Darity, he estimates the cost would be about $750 billion a year. But this would include both benefits and health insurance. And so finally, with at least 1/3 of workers in the private sector who don't get paid, many of them don't get paid sick leave, and a full quarter of Americans never enjoying paid vacation or holiday time, a federal jobs guarantee would offer other benefits to every hardworking person who wants them. If private companies underpaid or abused their employees in any ways, laborers could always leave their jobs, and they could leave their jobs not worrying about health insurance and things like that, but they could leave their jobs for government work. And so I think the FJG's brilliance really is the most obvious here, right? Is it keeps private companies who have historically shafted their workers at every turn, it keeps them as honest as we can possibly keep them without constantly passing legislation and conducting investigations. This keeps them as honest as possible because workers actually have a choice of who to work for. It's not a monopsony like it is in so many areas of this country, especially in rural America. There are so many places in this country where you only really have 1 or 2 choices as to who to work for. And you have to take whatever wage, whatever sexual harassment, whatever racial harassment, you have to take what they offer, and you can't do anything about your situation. And so this would really fundamentally restructure our society, I think, and it would also usher in a cultural and spiritual renaissance of sorts as we connect labor, in any kind of labor really, back to dignity. And no matter what the job, we've got to learn to not only think about, but to really promote the intrinsic value of our fellow human beings, no matter what kind of job, what kind of labor they do, and get back to learning to really honoring all work, not just work that turns a profit. And so after that, of course, we get to the summer, and the summer, of course, is a growth time for the harvest. And this is when I say that we can really concentrate, if we get all of these other things done, on kind of righting the wrongs of the past. And to me, that means, number one, reparations for slavery, as well as I should have had on here, reparations for Native Americans as well. Those are 2 very different things, but 2 things we definitely need to deal with in this country in order for there to be any kind of racial equity in this country on an economic or a political level. We need new branding for reparations, I think. Sandy Darity and Derek Hamilton, the economists, have done amazing work on this. And I think that the concept of baby bonds that they have is a really good one. And, if we look at wealth and not income, for any kind of government benefit or assistance purpose, we need to start just pouring money into primarily Black schools, primarily Indigenous schools. We need to right the wrongs reparations is not just a payment to people who are descendants of slaves or people who have been, forcibly removed from their land as indigenous people. It's also reparations at every level, from criminal justice system to education to everything that you can think of. This was how Ta-Nehisi Coates was so famous for saying that America has been plagued by 250 years of slavery, 90 years of Jim Crow, 60 years of separate but equal, 35 years of racist housing policy. So to be sure, Coates concluded that until we reckon with our compounding moral debts, America will never be whole. And I think that's completely right. One of the books I'm working on right now is on Lillian Smith, who is a white Georgia woman. She was an anti-racist, though, back even in the 1930s, 40s. She was friends with Martin Luther King and all the incredible freedom fighters and civil rights movement leaders. But really thinking about even the psychology of white Americans, we have got to deal with these sins of the past, I think, in order for us to confront white supremacy in any kind of meaningful way, even in a psychological way, for people who are progressive, who are leftists, who are liberals. We have to have some kind of atonement. We have to have some kind of making things right, where we have, our forefathers and even some of us have made them terribly wrong. And so, again, I think this kind of reparations for slavery and for Native Americans could very much be fit into the idea of a third Reconstruction, and it would historically fit in very, very well. And number 2 on here is women's rights. And I think the biggest issue with this, especially from a labor perspective, as I mentioned, is paying for what has historically been women's work, taking care of children, taking care of the elderly, taking care of the sick and the disabled. This has always historically been women's work, and it still overwhelmingly is. Now in America, it is very poor women's work. It's women who are working full-time jobs, more than full-time jobs, 2 full-time jobs, and still can't make a living. So we've got to pay well for people who are literally entrusted with the most important jobs in this entire world, right? Taking care of the elderly, the disabled, the young. These are the jobs that we need to be paying for and paying well. But given that, I think, as a historian looking over some of the advances and failures of our past, we definitely need some kind of agency, if not the Labor Department, something else, to really oversee this and really enforce equal pay protections for women and for Black, Indigenous people of color as well. And I think that, if we get through all of these kind of major things, that one of the things we could end with to make this nation really move into line with the rest of the developed world is having some kind of housing guarantee and trying to really, really end homelessness in America. I know, obviously, most of you guys are probably from the Pacific Northwest, where you have one of the highest homeless populations, obviously. And it is obviously just going to keep getting worse in the coming months, in the coming year. And climate change, of course, is going to have a whole lot to do with displacing entire populations and possibly even entire cities, entire areas in the future. And so the government has to start taking on the work of how do we house people? How do we give people basic housing that, according to any kind of ethical or moral code, a person deserves? And so I'm going to go ahead and bring this to a conclusion so that we can have time for questions and a discussion. But basically, I think that now is such a crucial time, and that there are so few times in history, throughout history, where you have such tragedy and such loss, and that's horrible. That's awful that we've all just gone through this, but it also offers a great opportunity because people are at the point where they're angry, they're tired, they feel like they've got nothing to lose. And I think we saw this summer with all of the protests, that people are putting the good of the community, the good of the greater good in front of their own safety, in front of their own security. and really stepping out of themselves and feeling like they're part of something bigger, and I don't want to couch this in religious terms, but I think that it does need to have an air of spirituality, and it needs to have an air of almost like a higher calling. And it doesn't have to be godlike, it doesn't have to be driven like that, but the higher calling is the community. The higher calling is taking care of other human beings, which is essentially why we are here, right? We're here to take care of others, to be good people. And morally and ethically, we have the chance right now to actually make changes while this country is in such great flux and while this country is divided, to really get out there and put out new ideas and put out new language and new ways of thinking about things. So now is the time to reassess the nation's staggering racial wealth gap and the 13th Amendment slavery loophole. Now is the time to act upon centuries of injustice, upon centuries of inequity, and upon the continuing legacies of slavery and Jim Crow. We're one of the richest nations in the world, but among those nations, we are one of the most unequal. And nearly all other developed nations offer a better standard of living for all of their citizens, regardless of income or wealth, than we do. But our problem, our shame, is that the vast poverty in our country is not due to lack of funds or wealth, but instead it's due to inequality and racism and classism. And so this is the way that the system was designed, right? As Martin Luther King correctly opined, the problem was ultimately structural. This country has socialism for the rich, rugged individualism for the poor. So if we want to join the other developed nations of the world, if we want money out of politics, if we want free and fair elections, if we want universal health care, affordable housing, or fewer worries about old age and retirement, if we want free college, job training, better K through 12 education, universal preschool, if we want a jobs guarantee, a universal income, a reduction or dissolution of our carceral system, or even a decent living wage for our citizens, we have to get up and fight. We have to do something about it. And the time to act, historically, I'm telling you, the time to act is right now. So thank you so much. And I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you. Join me in giving Dr. Keri Leigh Merritt a round of digital applause. I've got goosebumps over here. I'm excited. Sign me up. And yes, I do see we've got questions already popping into the chat room. I just want to say that I really appreciated everything you had to say. I think this idea of sort of a real program for change and sort of framing democracy within the horticultural analogy, I think is great, because it's, like a plant, right? Democracy needs to be tended or it will wilt, right? So I loved how you moved through kind of the phases of kind of clearing, the sort of pruning out the things that are just, fundamentally flawed, and in their absence, sort of planting things that can actually be generative of greater equity, and then sort of reaping that harvest. I think as you were talking, I was thinking about that idea of budgets being moral documents, right? And that, the particularly disgusting fact that it's not like we don't have the money, right? It's how we choose to sort of allocate that money. That's the real problem. I was thinking about that. It's funny because I was kind of jotting down some questions. My students and I, we just reread The Case for Reparations. So that Coates is very fresh on my mind. And I like that idea of the reparations being a matter of moral debt, right? That it's not just, this isn't something that's exclusively a financial question, right? And I'm kind of curious, and this will hopefully give everybody a chance to get questions on the board too. Within that essay, Coates claims that, before we can even start thinking about, assigning a price to reparations, right? We need to kind of like come to, I think he describes it as like a psychic confrontation with the truth of our national history, right? And so my question is like, where do we even begin that work after 2020, right? How do we rescue kind of like the real history from obscurity and then deliver it to folks who, seem to be sort of occupying an alternate reality in terms of, what is real. And, we sort of live in this sort of post-truth reality now. Where do we, like, I'm all in, but even as an educator, sometimes I don't even know where to start.
That's a great question, something I think about all the time. And I think that I call it, we need to democratize knowledge. We need to democratize knowledge. First of all, we need to know that there's always going to be a percentage of white people in this country that we just basically need to write off and know that they are never going to change, that they're always going to hold on to white supremacy and completely write them off and try to figure out how to move around them. And not try to get them on our side. But there still is a sector of white people that I think are willing and able. Of course, young people in this country have done nothing but give me hope lately. But I think to democratize knowledge means that we have to, especially as historians, start rethinking the way that we communicate with the public. And I don't just mean, like this, but it's structurally, not just writing books, not just writing op-eds, that, how do most people get information these days? They get it visually, they get it, on social media. And so that was actually, I'm not a filmmaker by trade by any means, but I decided that I really wanted to do the Civil War documentary because I thought that that would be the way that I would be able to reach the most Americans with some kind of true history, right? People will watch a film when they won't read a book, especially if you make it in a certain way. And so I think that we need to think about doing history through film, doing history through short things like this tonight, short informational sessions, author talks, speaking with the community, speaking to actual people. But I think it's that, and it's also going to be combined with completely restructuring that educational system, rewriting old textbooks, and really either giving teachers who know this history and this and civics and everything a way to teach what they want to teach without suffering repercussions for it, but also to teach the teachers who don't know this history, teach them the real history and the civics and everything that they need to know. So it's a multi-step process. It's not going to be quick, but I think that we certainly can do it within the next 10 years or so. Really, really turn things around.
Excellent, thanks. And I do see some questions coming in. Actually, my question sort of overlapped with a couple of the questions that were sort of pouring in from the audience. Do you have a question? What about greed? How do you combat the fear of giving up anything you already have for the public good?
Again, with that, I think it's, you're not going to change the minds of elites who have tons of money. That has been a constant throughout, American history, is that those are the people who control and command everything and who do use racism as a tool and who engender racial hatred in between groups of laborers. And so I don't think you can necessarily combat greed. I think you can put a check on it by, taxing billionaires and multi-millionaires. I think you can do lots of things differently from a regulatory perspective in businesses and things like that. But I mean, greed is, we've always had greed historically. It's not going away.
Excellent. I did have a question about your observation surrounding the sort of the emergence of a third Reconstruction. And actually one of the very last things you said sort of made me think about this. I'm kind of curious to know about how you see sort of the relationship between what would ultimately be kind of progressive legislation that leads to greater workers' rights and sort of the civil rights related movements we're seeing right now. And knowing, as a colleague of Mike Honey, who's done a ton of work on Martin Luther King Jr. and sort of his poor people's campaigns and his, sort of the focus of his work in the latter 5-6 years of his life surrounding organizing and sort of looking for economic justice. Do do you get the sense that sort of the we're seeing sort of a confluence between the race-related uprisings of the last summer and because I think, from a labor perspective, I'm also seeing a lot of activity over there, but I'm not sure that they're quite coalescing yet.
Yeah, I've been doing a lot of interviews over the last couple of weeks for the big Amazon unionization push in Bessemer, Alabama. And so this perfectly demonstrates your question. I was just talking to a journalist today, and hearkening back to some of the work that Mike Honey and as well as Rob and DG Kelly have done, in Alabama, where it really does show like that period of the 1930s and 40s in Alabama, where not only Blacks, but whites were organizing rapidly, and not only just organizing, but becoming socialists and becoming communists. And this kind of grassroots organization, in a lot of ways, was it laid the groundwork for the civil rights movement. And when you think about the percentages of people who are making, non-living wages in this country, obviously minorities are way overrepresented in relation to the percentage of the population that they comprise. And so it is, the labor struggle in this country has always been a civil rights struggle. But I think that what's really been smart about a lot of these leaders in Bessemer, Alabama, which is a town that's over 70, it might even be over 75% Black, that they are calling this a civil rights struggle, and they are reframing it in that way. And it does evoke a different meaning to people, especially people of color in this country. And they do see it as a higher spiritual calling than, just talking about, joining a union.
Yeah, I think that falls under the history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes sort of way of looking at things. I was telling my students just recently, we tend to think, here in the Pacific Northwest, we tend to think of, the politics of Alabama in a very, that state is as red as it gets. And you don't, a lot of people don't know about the history of organizing, interracial organizing down in Mobile. I mean, there's a long history, and there's an intellectual heritage in that state.
Absolutely. And it goes back into the 19th century. Alabama has always been kind of an outlier in the Deep South, because even, not only in early Reconstruction, but especially in the populism movement. Populism was extremely strong in Alabama, and that was, of course, a biracial coalition of Blacks and poor and working class and lower middle class whites, really.
Nice. We've got another question on the board from James, who says, my question is about the ways those in the private sector isolate workers by making them feel special. Quote, "You're holding this place together. You're a leader. Everything here is terrible but you." Any thoughts on how to get around this tactic?
I think that most workers don't buy that, right? Most workers don't, they see it for the BS that it is, and that it's lip service, and they'd much prefer a living wage and good benefits to being told they're wonderful. Because again, historically, even if it's somebody being, what we consider dirty jobs, even if you're working in a dirty job, you still have a sense of identity and a sense of being able to bring home money and a sense of, having a job. And that's been important psychologically. So it's not, what your boss says to you. Historically, we all hate our bosses, right? So I think that's going to be a much easier psychological hurdle, as long as you're telling people how they're going to benefit, not only economically, but politically as well.
That is, that language has sort of infected the corporatese speak, right? Yeah. You're not an employee, you're a team member. If you work at Walmart, you're an associate, whatever that means. We've got another question here from, where was Jordan brought up campaign finance reform. And this is an incredibly ambitious list. And I think, after Citizens United and after Trump and what he's done to the Supreme Court, where do we even start in terms of any kind of campaign finance reform?
I mean, I think we've got to go to the same system that pretty much all of Europe uses, is that you just have strictly publicly financed campaigns, that you literally have no private donors at all. You take money completely out of politics. Each political party, each person running as a candidate gets X amount of dollars, gets X amount of time on TV commercials, get X amount of time on radio commercials, equal, and it's publicly financed. Otherwise, you've got a very small cadre of elite white people running everything in this country.
Nice, and keep those questions coming. I told Keri Leigh we wouldn't keep her too late because she's 3 hours ahead of us out there in Atlanta. Oh, Mike Honey's here. Great overview of the issues. Do you have an organizing strategy? The new Poor People's Campaign does a good job, but doesn't have the power to get change.
I think one of the things that the left has really been missing, obviously I'm not including people in the squad or things like that, but we really need some really good, strong, charismatic candidates out there that can really kind of revolutionize leadership and really, really push these issues, because let's be honest, the vast amount of working class people and even middle class people don't have the time to stay up with what's going on in the news, to check what's going on nationally or even locally. That nobody has the time for that. So we need some really, really good charismatic leaders who are able to effectively communicate really complicated things in a soundbite and really explain to people how each individual policy would benefit them. Explain to poor and working class whites how reparations can actually benefit them, because it can be explained. We just have to find the people to do it.
I agree. I think we really need to start primarying some of these, these incumbents. And I think, the DNC is not going to fall in line with that. But if anything is going to change, that's sort of where it needs to happen. And it needs to happen with, organizing on a local level to apply that pressure, right?
Right. And I think, I'm in Georgia, so Stacey Abrams, seeing what she's doing, carrying that kind of a movement, this grassroots organizing movement out in each individual state, where you do have these individual communities going out and running things and really revolutionizing the way that politics is done. She and all of the mainly women at the grassroots level, and particularly Black women in Georgia who have run this grassroots campaign, are now going around to different states and teaching them how to do this. And I think that's we need that, absolutely, but we still also need the leaders.
Yeah, it's kind of like a labor notes school for aspiring political operatives of the left. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. I see we've got a question. This is more of a comment about sort of teaching the public to boycott bad companies, and the importance of boycotts as sort of another way to leverage our power as consumers. I think that's a big, spot on. I was excited to hear you talking about UBI, which, I feel like we're in the middle of sort of the the worst experiment ever with UBI, surrounding these $2,000 checks, which are apparently $1,400 checks, which apparently a lot of us aren't even going to get in the first place. And then just here in Tacoma, we're not that far removed from Canada. Where they have had a very different experience throughout the pandemic in terms of subsidizing people to stay home and people to take care of themselves before sort of spreading the pandemic. Do you think is that with the recent sort of the parliamentary sort of cancellation of the federal minimum wage, the whole $2,000 check debacle, are we drifting farther away from that conversation?
I think the Democratic Party is, but I think there's going to be a huge pushback, because there has to be. I mean, people are literally going to be starving and homeless in a few months, and especially if this pandemic doesn't end as quickly as we think it's going to. And I mean, you just see what a failed state we are through all of this, because every other developed nation in the world, nations that have far, far, far less wealth than we have been able to do this and do it effectively and do it immediately. And I think some of us thought that things would change once there were Democrats in office. One thing I did want to point out about this is that most people don't realize unemployment benefits are issued through the states. The states are the ones that run, the checks to people, and that do checks, background checks, and all that kind of stuff as to whether or not people are really unemployed. And so, if you're from a red-controlled state, which I am at the state level, we had our labor commissioner just didn't pay people checks. He just didn't cut them, and certainly turned down tens of thousands of people who should have been getting them, just because he's Republican and there's no challengers and he can basically do whatever he wants, and there's no kind of national attention to what's going on at the state level. And so if you're in a red state or a state that's poorly run, you may not be getting those federal benefits that you should be getting.
Yeah, it seems like from my perspective, and again, I don't know in sort of the news vacuum that we exist in, like if everybody is seeing this, but this, this whole last year and a half has been sort of a case study in how different state governments are sort of serving their voting populations. And it just seems like, I mean, I think I mentioned before everybody got in the room, like, Inslee is not without his flaws, believe me. But there have been things that when I look sort of into different parts of the country, I see him doing sort of much more effectively than other state legislators. So we've got, I don't want to keep you up too late. Do you have time for maybe one or two more?
Yeah, and I see there's Jordan's, I think, got a hand up. I don't know if you can see that. Okay.
He's back in the chat room. He's kind of piggybacking off Joanne's earlier question. He says, among my peer group, we have people that the system worked for, middle class to corporate lawyer or high level in the health insurance, but they still voted for Biden, socially liberal, but anything else in terms of real economic transformation, a bridge too far. How do we bring those folks into the tent, so to speak?
I think a lot of it, again, is going to come down to some really good, charismatic leaders. And I think a lot of it does come down to power and our understanding of power and how power works. And I think that liberals historically, and especially today, do a horrible job of figuring out how to use power, how to consolidate power. It's almost if we're too timid to do anything, to try anything, to really assert ourselves on a lot of things. I mean, just like this parliamentarian debacle. Somebody could go in there and fire them immediately, but that hasn't happened. I was actually listening to a Stokely Carmichael recording that he did in 1968 yesterday and transcribing some of it. And it was really interesting how he was talking about how liberals, white liberals, not leftists, but white liberals really didn't want change. The whole point of having white liberals was to stall change and to keep the status quo. And unfortunately, my personal belief is that the vast majority of the traditional Democratic Party is much like that. They just want to keep their positions of power, and they're not really willing to change things for people who are really, really hurting and in pain in this country.
Yeah, well, far be it from me to argue with Stokely Carmichael on that fact. I think that is 100%. So we've got, let's see, we have one more here. This is a masterless. I had some masterless men questions too, but I feel like we're sort of in the 21st century now. But this one is the book talk about conscripting the poor whites to fight a war to keep slavery. While it was wrong then, would a draft now get more people vested in stopping the military-industrial complex? Interesting question.
That's I think it would. I actually need to figure out how to work that more into this talk as well. But I mean, I'm a complete anti-imperialist pacifist. I think that the armed forces preys on poverty and preys on people of color in this country. And I think that, instead of having this huge military presence that we're spending, ungodly amounts of money on, we instead take that money. And this goes back to MLK again. You take that money that we're spending overseas and actually invest it at home. And yes, you can have an army of workers here. You can have an army of people who are doing things like, going out to disaster zones and dealing with climate change, or any number of different jobs that we can put these people in, redoing infrastructure, creating light rails, anything that, any kind of jobs, anything that we need in this country could be being done by people who are in the armed services. And our money would actually be put to use for the people in this country.
Budgets are moral documents, right?
Absolutely.
Well, this was absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us. This was, again, like I said, this, you were one of the first names that occurred to me when we came up with this seminar idea. So it's great to finally get you in and to get you in on this sort of, year in the book celebration. I cannot wait do you want to tease any projects? I know you've got your documentary. Is there?
Yeah, and hopefully in the next couple of weeks, I'll have something out to let you guys know. We're working on an edited collection from a bunch of historians about the year of 2020. So.
Excellent. All right. And we've got the Twitter handle on the screen. Thank you so much. This was fantastic. I'm going to stop recording.
Great. Thank you guys for having me. Thanks for turning out tonight. I really appreciate it.